from WBRN Radio and on the Bostonred Network. This Week in Economics by a Numbers Man and our sponsor, as usual, Cranston Analytics. A very interesting week that we have just, as they say, completed in the field of economics. We have some information out here, personal income outlays, etc., and we'll go to that in a minute. We also have the Consumer Confidence Index from the University of Michigan. Dr. Curtin there, it has started to wean. Consumers are starting to understand basically what is happening. We always end our forecasts exalting the consumer to keep their eyes on the prize. Evidently, they have been doing that, and we are now starting to enter the what is termed the Trump economy. Now, we've been in the Barack Obama economy, and there will be still some parts of it, but as we go more into the Trump economy, big headline we were looking at, I believe it was the Washington Post, that people now have minimized the effectiveness, the impact of the quote-unquote tax cuts. Anecdotal information is that when people get a tax cut, say $50, $100 extra in their paycheck, after a number of months it becomes routine. That particular money is either discretionary or they are saving it, one of two or three different things. But it becomes a normalization, and once that happens, they know that they're not going to see any more quote-unquote bonuses coming through the mail. We used to say coming through the mail, no longer obviously that would happen. But this in itself is one of the situations we find ourselves in on the 1st of July 2018. This is our first program for July, and we're in Q2. This is the second quarter. It's somewhat of a defining quarter, but at the same time we have the tariff program out there, and we're starting to see a little bit of light from it in terms of where the tariffs are going, and some are just starting. They have not started. They won't start until a few days into July. I believe July 12th, a week or two off before some of those kick in. Some have already kicked in on steel and aluminium or aluminum, whatever you want to call it, and those targeted towards Canada. Canada has retaliated, targeted towards the EU. The EU is also working on retaliation. The Trump administration announced that they will look at automobiles. Well, it doesn't really matter what they look at. There's some retaliatory activity there. And from Bloomberg, we saw an article on the Republic of Korea, known as South Korea. Activity there is a little bit muted because, again, all of these nations make things and they export them to the U.S. So that is, cars are a big part of that particular economy and how it will affect them. Part of it is we start to look now at the psychology of the whole tariff regime, more so than the tariffs. So what happens with the tariffs is those that are doing business with these various parties, those will just be passed on to consumers. Yes, they're a small part of the American economy, but some of those items will affect consumers directly, period. There was an announcement via Twitter by DJ Trump that the Saudi King bin Salman had announced that there's spare capacity. He could pump up to, the Saudis, up to 2 million barrels per day. That has been backed up, backed off. He gave a very conditional statement. We'll get to that from Bloomberg. These would be some of the key points we're talking about. One of the things to remember, the tariffs have never been effective. They've had problems before with those because of retaliation. There were also rumors that the Trump administration will quit the WTO, as a negotiating mechanism. Whether they will or will not quit the WTO, we don't know at this particular time period. But the tariffs are beginning to have a psychological effect. And if you get the psychological effect there, people get much more pessimistic about the economy. And let's get to that part of it now, and we'll get a few numbers here, and we'll go to Bloomberg. We'll use Reuters and the BBC in our report. But firstly, we go to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. This is released on Thursday, the 28th of June. National income and product accounts, gross domestic product first quarter, third estimate. Corporate profits first quarter revised estimates, that's 2018. The gross domestic product, GDP, increased at an annual rate of 2% in the first quarter, Q1, according to the third estimate released by the Bureau. In the fourth quarter, real GDP increased also 2%. The estimates released today based upon a more complete data sets. We'll call them big data here. And personal consumption expenditure, PDE, but let's get to a little bit of this. The real domestic income, GDI, increased 3.6% in a Q1 compared with an increase of 1% in a Q4. The average real GDP and real GDI, a supplemental measurement of economic activity that have equal weight, increased 2.8% in Q1 compared with an increase of 2% in Q4. That would be Q4 of 2017. The increase in real GDP in the first quarter reflects positive contributions from non-residential fixed income, PCE, exports, federal government spending, and state and local government spending that were offset by negative contributions from residential fixed investment, private inventory investment, imports, which are subtracted from the calculation of GDP. The deceleration of real GDP growth in the first quarter reflects deceleration in PCE, exports, state and local government spending, federal government spending, a slowdown in residential fixed investment. These movements were partially offset by similar decreases in private inventory investment and a large increase in non-residential fixed investment, imports which are subtracted from it. Current dollar GDP at 1.2% are $206 billion in Q1, a level of 10,996,000,000 in the fourth quarter. Currently, the dollar GDP increased at 5.3%, or $258.5 billion. The price index for gross domestic purchases increased 2.7% in Q1, compared with an increase of 2.5% in Q4. The PCE price index increased 2.5% compared with 2.7%, excluding food, energy prices, etc., compared with an increase of 1.8%. Now, updates to GDP. The percentages in real GDP was a revised 0.2% from the second estimate. So some revisions going on. So we look at current dollar GDP at a real GDP at 2.3%, and that was in the advanced estimate, down to 2.2%, and in the third estimate actually at 2%. Current dollar GDP at 4.3% in the advance, and in the next 4.2%, still 4.2%. Real GDI in the second estimate at 2.8, and it's now 3.6. The average of real GDP and GDI at 2.5% and 2.8%. Gross domestic purchases index, one of the things we look at in the advanced estimate was 2.8, the second estimate and third estimate at 2.7. The PCE price index, another index that we look at in the second estimate, was 2.6, now it's 2.5. So we can see that things are going downwards. Corporate profits from the current production with inventory valuation adjustment, etc. Profits of domestic financial corporations increased 7 billion in Q1, in contrast to a decrease of 14.6 billion in Q4. Profits from domestic non-financial corporations increased 28.8 billion compared with 19.4 billion. The rest of the world's profits increased 8.7 billion, in contrast to a decrease of 5.9 billion in Q1. Receipts increased 20 billion, and payments increased 17.2 billion. And that basically does it there from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. You can see that the economy itself, under the latest estimate, has in fact slowed. Now let's go to this is from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Also, personal income and outlays for May of 2018. This is released on a Friday. Personal income increased at 60 billion for 0.4% in May, according to the estimate released today. Disposable personal income (DPI) increased 63.2 billion, or 0.4%. Their personal consumption expenditures increased 27.8. We talked about that, or 0.2%. Real DPI increased 0.2% in May. Real PCE decreased less than 0.1%. PCE price index increased 0.2%, excluding food and energy. So those are some of the things looking at here. Current dollar income at 0.4. That was in January. 0.4 in February. 0.3 in March. 0.2 in April, and 0.4 in May. Personal consumption expenditure. We went through this actually in April. It was 0.5 and 0.2 in May. We did the price index also. Won't do it again here. Let's just a minute here. The increase in personal income in May primarily reflect increase in wages and salaries. Personal dividend income and non-farm proprietary income. The 1.4 billion decrease in real PCE in May reflects a decrease in spending for services that were partially offset by an increase in spending for goods. Within goods, recreational goods, vehicles was a leading contributor to the increase. Within services, the largest contributor to the decrease was spending for household utilities. We're seeing those enter the fray, as one would say. Personal outlay increased 29.2 billion in May. Personal savings, this is the first time we got into this one, at 482 billion in May. And the personal savings rate, personal savings as a percentage of disposable income, was 3.2%. Updates to personal income and outlays. Estimates have been revised from January through April. The percentage change from the preceding months to current dollar income. And we will look at some of these revisions here. The current dollar income, the previous was 40.7, revised to 51.1. That was in March. And in April, it was the previous estimate was 0.3% now to 2%. Personal consumption expenditures. And well, we look at chain dollars. These now we're using a $2009. At 60.5, it was revised to 72.1. And let's see upcoming reports here. The release will be on the 31st of July will be the next release. So this does it for that particular one. And let me just sort of go back here a little bit. And this is from Bloomberg. We talked about it in our introductory remarks. U.S. backs off Trump's tweet on Saudis helping lower oil prices. The administration backed off an assertion DJ Trump made early, indicating that he persuaded the Saudi Arabia to effectively boost oil production to maximum capacity, which would have threatened to blow up the fragile truce agreed by OPEC. And inflame, of course, their Saudi-Iran rivalry. Just spoke to King Solomon, and he explained to him that because of the turmoil and dysfunction in Iran and Venezuela, I was asking that Saudi Arabia increase their production maybe up to 2 million barrels per day to make up the difference. But in a statement from the White House, King Salman bin Abdulaziz affirmed that Saudi Arabia has 2 billion barrels a day spare capacity, which it will prudently use if and when necessary to ensure market balance and stability. The White House statement aligns with one made by the state-run Saudi press, saying that the king and Trump in a phone call discussed the issue. The agency did not say the leaders agreed and made reference to the 2 billion a day. Now, this is where you get into some very, very tricky situations, and the Trump administration and their general staff is totally inexperienced and, in our opinion, incompetent in economic matters. And when you put out a statement that a government has agreed to do something, that statement is seen as factual. But when you back it up, then people attentiveness to your future statements is suspect. It's like our producer in the 2009 during the Depression, O.T. Leo, had a free strikes maxim. And basically what happens is when you give out information as coming from the DJ Trump tweet store, if you put out one item that is factually incorrect, you have a strike. If you put out 2 items that is factually incorrect, you're at strike 2. This is a baseball analogy. And when you get to free strikes, you're just out. And this happens more and more. People will just simply not take it at face value. And this is from Bloomberg saying, well, the exchange proved that the Saudis are more amenable to DJ Trump than to Barack Obama. From Iran, it says if the Saudis had agreed to the Trump administration request, that would mean he's calling upon them to walk out from OPEC. Iran's OPEC governor there, Mr. Hosseini, said in the interview there's no way one country can go to 2 million barrels a day above the production allocation unless they are walking out of OPEC, period. And this is something to remember. There are a number of producers there. Brent crude topped $80 a barrel in mid-May, the highest since 2014. It is now, it closed at, we'll get to these, $79.44. U.S. unleaded gas prices, including tax, averaged about $2.83 a gallon in June the 25th, that's according to the Energy Information Administration. That is up about 55 cents from the same period last year. So that impacts its spare capacity here. If the Saudis were to respond to the request, it would stretch its spare capacity to its limits, meaning that the supply outage would cause outside effects on petroleum. It would likely aggravate other members such as Iran, Venezuela, which agreed to prevent any increase there. And yeah, and once you get this out of line, you got problems. The Saudis have a capacity to pump a maximum of 12.4 tenths a million barrels a day, according to the International Energy Agency. The kingdom pumps slightly more than 10 billion barrels in a May. Analysts and consultants needlessly think that the kingdom could produce 12 barrels a day in an emergency through a so-called surge. Saudi Arabia's share with Kuwait in so-called neutral zone hasn't been used for the past few years. But that is very, very dangerous, because if you ramp that production up and there is any problems, you have all kinds of problems going on. That was a meeting in Vienna that was on the 22nd of June. OPEC and its allies cobbled together a delicate accord to satisfy some of the members. And Iran is trying to figure out ways to get around the sanctions that are coming, but Iran has had sanctions for many, many years there. Let's go to the survey from the University of Michigan in no particular order. This is for June 2018. The index of consumer sentiment in June was at 98.2. In May it was at 98, and it was at 95 in June of 2017. The current economic conditions at 116.5. That's in June of 18, and in May it was at 111.8 tenths. It was at 112.4 in June of 17. The index of consumers at 86.3. It was 89.1 in May of this year, and it was 83.8 in June of last year. This is from Dr. Curtin here. Consumer sentiment retreated in late June to just above May, the reading largely due to concerns about potential impacts of tariffs on the domestic economy. The fall-off in consumer confidence was minor, as the sentiment index has been virtually unchanged for the past 3 months, and there's reasons for this we'll get into in a minute. The persistent strength had been due to favorable assessment of jobs and income, while consumers anticipated rising interest rates during the year ahead. Those expect increases were associated with a modest decline in long-term prospects for the national economy. For the year ahead, consumers still anticipate the economy would produce small additional declines in unemployment, as well as higher wages. We haven't seen that We dealt with that last broadcast. Consumers also anticipate an uptick in inflation during the year ahead, partially due to a rise in energy prices and partially due to the tariffs. The potential impact of tariffs on domestic economy was spontaneously cited by 1 in 4 consumers, with most expecting a negative impact in a domestic economy, 21% out of 26. The primary concern was a downshift in future pace of economic growth and an uptick in inflation. The long-standing belief consumers is that trade with other countries result in a broader range of available goods at lower prices. When asked if the current survey about their views on international trade, 2/3 of consumers thought that more trade with other countries would be better for the domestic economy. To be sure, consumer judgment about the impact of higher tariffs will not crystallize until they gain more experience. And this is basically what our models are saying. So we point to August, where we'll start to get some type of indication. Will actually change in product prices, domestic employment, while tariffs may have a direct impact on a very small portion of overall GDP. The negative impact could quickly generate and produce a widespread decline in consumer confidence. This is from the University of Virginia, University of Michigan. New measurements of inflation presented to the European Central Bank. Oh boy. Annual form last week shows no sign of pickup when updated with May data, adding to signs there is not much of a case for concern in prices despite a low unemployment in the U.S. of 18 years. Specifically, a sensitive inflation index measurement, a type of inflation central banks care about, the kind that responds to changes in the unemployment rate, which in turn influences through interest rates. Sorry about that. The index was unchanged at 2.65 last month, according to data from Bloomberg, based on Commerce Department figures released on Friday, the highest since 2009. That is still below the average level of the last two U.S. economic expansions. Suggests a lower employment rate at 3.8% isn't leading to too much inflation at the moment. And 3.5 is forecast. The federal policy makers and the Federal Reserve at 2% annual rate there, that gauged for 2.3% in May from a year earlier, the most since 2012. The GSI gauge was developed by James Stark and Mark Watson, they're economists from Harvard and Princeton, who for decades have helped shape the field of quantitative techniques. It responds to a puzzle facing global central banks. The old Phillips curve relation, we've talked about that before. Unemployment and inflation at the heart of their theoretical model doesn't look as solid as it used to. Their work, similar to pro-cycle inflation index published by the Federal Reserve in San Francisco. The index differs in their components. The CDI gauge includes food, utilities, and things like education, communications, professional and personal services, while Frisco does not. The central bank's gauge includes prescription drugs as well as goods and services purchased by nonprofits, while Stark and Watson does not. The second is weighting. Housing makes up a larger portion of the CSI gauge while recreation services, food services, accommodations account for a larger share of the Frisco Fed Index. The difference helped explain why the Frisco Fed Index picked up in May, although little change over the last 4 years. I think that's a very good explanation of what is going on with inflation. And of course, we'll continue to look at inflation. Higher oil prices, we target $440 a year there that we'll be seeing. The average household will have less to spend this year due to pump prices. Strong prices drove the cost of U.S. gas to the highest level in more than 3 years last month, according to AAA, and pump prices are now 27% higher than they were a year ago. That could disproportionately constrain a low to middle-income American spending if it doesn't slow down a healthy and more energy-dependent economy. That is according to an economist at S&P Global Economics there, Mr. Pandy. Anyway, this would be tantamount to a tax increase for American households. This is Panday and Bravino. This is especially true for middle to low income types. The higher income earners who saw a tax break would be less affected. And that is one of the things that the depending on what the moderate to low income people received as a tax break, some people average of $50 or less per month. Obviously, that would be taken away by this increase in gasoline. So this is one of the things they're looking at there, and the Federal Reserve is looking at it. Vano and Pandy say even a period of $70 to $80 a barrel want a damper growth. Okay. Be interesting to see how that result turns out. Some from the stress test more flexible in the new Fed, so to revise the flex test. Stress test, I'm sorry, not flex test. The banks took off one capital hit due to 2017. Tax overhaul got a conditional pass, a departure from the Fed's traditional stress pass-fail approach to quantitative capital issues, while scandal-plagued and Wells Fargo was able to double share of buyback programs. Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan were dinged since their capital fell below the federal minimum, but the regulators responded this year's sound more of an industry-friendly tone than under Chairman Powell. They have allowed firms to pass on the basis there was special circumstances. This is a very, very troubling situation. Applied levels of pragmatism in a way that they haven't in the past. The new Fed, it's a signal to me earlier, retirement of the super strict quantitative tests. Mike Alex made that from Financial Services. Okay. The Fed on Thursday approved the capital plan of 34 leading leaders, following a second leg of its annual test period introduced after the Depression. The U.S. tax code rewrites signed into law in December means Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley results were weighted in part by changes to the treatment of past losses on hypothetical tax bill under the Fed's scenario. And we'll finish this up here. Uh-oh. This reinforces how the Fed was less draconian in how it reacted to the results. Well, Wells Fargo won approval for a higher payout rate of U.S. banks. This Powell and Coyles said they believe stress testing can be more transparent and less discretionary, but banks continue to worry that the Fed's rule easing may not go far enough, and it could inadvertently make life tougher if changes are not fine-tuned. The point, for example, to the Fed's April proposal to introduce stress capital buffers that would work in tandem with stress tests to move the system away from strict annual quantitative pass-fail. In the blog published on Friday, the Clearinghouse, that's a bank trade group, warned the proposal as written could actually exacerbate their capital planning challenges by requiring banks to capitalize themselves against stress losses year-round. Well, very interesting there. This is from Reuters. That was from Bloomberg. Wait a minute. Or was that from Reuters? From Reuters. Anyway, China factory growth slowed in June as trade tensions rise. On the other side, in China, the economy has already felt the pinch. That's in China. Multi-year crackdown on risky loans. They've been working on this. The official Purchase Managers Index, PMI, released on Friday, fell to 51.5 in June, below the forecast of 51.6, down from 51.9 in May. So we'll have more on the Chinese economy later here. Pressure on demand, well, that is it. Domestic demand is weakening, and external demand faces pressure from escalating trade friction between the U.S. and China. After May's official factory PMI tumbled to a touch in 8 months, high, there's been some increasing signs that the economy is finally slowing. Credit growth has slowed down. That's a good thing, actually, for China. There was too much credit available there. In May, industrial output, retail sales, and fixed investment income all missed expectations as automobile sales dropped. Local governments scaled back building projects. Some local governments have been building too much. Market losses, sell-offs, of course, on the market has threatened to impose duties on 450 billion of Chinese imports, with the first 34 billion in portion go into effect. That'll be on June 6th. We talked about that early. A sister survey shows growth in China's service system picked up slightly in June, with the official non-manufacturing purchase managing index at rising from 55 to 55 from 54.9. A little bit different here. The composite PMI of both manufacturing and services slipped to 54.4 in June from 54.6. Not too concerned about that. Now let's do the numbers. Let's see here. We'll do stocks and commodities. We're still trying to find a satisfactory way of doing this, but nonetheless, We'll start at the bottom here in Asia. The Nikkei, let's see, where was the Nikkei? I'm going to do this. Yeah, well, at 34.12. In the tropic was at 3.89. The Hang Seng index at 454.79. And the S&P ASX index was down 20.75. And we'll go to Europe now. The FTSE, where was the old FTSE? 21.30. The DAC was at 128.72. In France, they were, all these are in the plus column, at 47.89. In Spain, they were at 38.70. And in New York, the Dow was at 55.36. The NASDAQ at 6.02. We won't do the composite index here. We'll look at now commodities, very, very important here. The Bloomberg Commodity Index at 179.95. The change was 1.29. That's commodities index. To the Reuters Jeffers Index at 1.54 was the change. It's at 205.33. Depending on how it's read. So those are some indexes, the commodity indexes here. Energy, Brent crude at $70.23. West Texas Intermediate was at $74.15. And that's for August contract. And the Brent crude was for September contract there. The gasoline index was up 4.57. Heating oil was up 3.0 or not 7. Let's see. Gold on the COMEX at $1,254.50. On the spot at $1,252.50. It was up $3.90. Silver was up 16 cents at $16.20. We'll do platinum here, I suppose. It was up, let's see. Well, anyway, it was at 8.53, 8.36, if you want to go that way, or 3.80, where it was up there. And if we look at some of these others, cocoa was up 61. They're not making this very easy to see. It's in green. Anyway, corn was up $17.75. 17.75. Coin, that was wheat. Corn was up 5.26. Live cattle. We still haven't found pork bellies. We have to look those up. Anyway, they were up $3. $3. So that does our commodities. Hopefully we've put the mosaic together here. Basically speaking, this is a short week, a holiday week, Independence Day in the U.S. Wish everyone happy and safe Independence Day in the U.S. The rest of the world, though, is tackling these tariff regimes. No doubt oil pricing is very, very important. We'll see where that lands with OPEC. Basically, the rest of the summer, the price level will be in the 70s to perhaps the 80s. Some spare capacity out there. Venezuela, of course, has not been able to make its quota. We don't know what Saudi Arabia will do. They do have some spare capacity with Kuwait, whether that will come online or not. We haven't found out what the producers in North Dakota, etc., are doing. That's domestic producers. The compression method known as shale, the shale oil producers. A lot of that is going in to Europe as liquefied gas. We'll see where that is going. There's the Russian Federation, some others are all pricing that, Brent crude. There's a whole lot of machinations going on in energy pricing. One has to understand that this move by the Saudis to keep prices down is an artificial market, which meant if anything happened in Saudi Arabia or to some of the other producers, they would have to make up more than 2 million barrels per day. For instance, if Venezuela drops unexpectedly, Nigeria, etc., other things could happen. The energy prices would be up. And, of course, disposable income, that's something we don't talk about enough, but that's a fairly fragile situation. In our last broadcast, we talked about compensation, wage compensation. Wages have basically not went up 2.5% perhaps, but are they keeping up with inflation? No. And some of the corporates there, housing, very important, overpriced, no doubt about it. The rental market in many areas is overpriced. Housing in itself is overpriced, coupled with a low supply. Labor problems in the housing market did not come in. The automobile market for the last few months has been depressed. So in other words, there's some little things that are sort of coming out here that we have not looked at in terms of the dynamics of the economy. So some of those are coming. The tariffs, yes, they will affect little of the quote-unquote overall economy as we see it. But if low and middle-class consumers start to spend less, because obviously they will have less to spend, it will start impacting some of the larger retailers. Walmart comes to mind here, and that has a ripple effect across the retailing sector. Of course, there are less retailers out there today than there were 1 year ago. Be interesting to start looking at how Amazon is doing and some of those, how that impact is happening, and some of the mergers in the wireless industry, costs there for smartphone services, etc. That is into the picture. And we have a few things that enter into the picture for where consumers spend their money. We'll spend a little time on that, but basically we deal with macroeconomics here. Will the Fed raise interest rates one more time? We here at the mic believe they will, because inflation will move up. There's no doubt about that. food prices and other things have not shown any abatements at all. There's, I was over at a market. They effectively have increased as much as 30% or more. And things have to happen there. I was looking at the vegetable counter. Then we went towards the meat counter, etc. The prices were much different than a year in the past. So it's interesting to see where all of this is going. And in the next few months, we'll start to see it more vividly. Of course, in the summer, we have secondary resources, farmers markets, etc., fresh produce in most every area of the country. Of course, we do have a heat wave, and haven't looked at how it's affecting crops in the Midwest, but definitely there are some effects. Nonetheless, for those in business, make next week a productive one. For the consumer, obviously, the eye on the economy of the prize. Consumers are starting to take note. Confidence even in our enthusiasm gauge, I suppose, about the tax cuts is waning. And not only that, the full impact, we know what the impact is on the larger corporations, but on the small and medium-sized businesses, a lot of that has not actually been understood, and it will be obviously when they file the 2018 and 19 returns. So there is a lot of extra working there, as with the banks and their modified stress tests, which could cause problems. And this, so one of the problems you have when you start getting into a lot of deregulation, that basically caused the last depression, is a deregulation of some of the financial services. People did not see it coming. But definitely there will be course corrections. The market was running hotter than it is now. But once more, some of the basic stocks, GE got delisted from the exchange. Walgreens went on there, but also at the same time, Amazon made some moves, bought an online prescription operation. Now, the Walgreens in the world of the world and these online prescription operations, a large amount of their customers are people on Medicare and some on Medicaid. And as those items are refactored, we'll call it a reposition, etc., that will affect the spending on these drugs, which will affect Walgreens and also demographics. Have a good week, everyone. Good day.